Formalist criticism, structuralism. Greetings, everyone. In today's presentation, we will observe the critical approach known as structuralism. So I like to begin with a discussion, as in the New Criticism presentation, a discussion between Plato and Aristotle. Now, I'll make this discussion a little bit more brief. But I think it's important to note these foundations because they kind of set the stage for the structuralist agenda. So Plato's sense of truth, right? We ask what's the in addressing a metaphysical issue, right? Nature of being. What's the truth of the world? And so Plato came out and he said, look. One thing I can say is that the sensory world, right? The world that we deem as truthful as based on the senses, that's not the truth of reality. That's a flawed reality. It's a deceptive reality. That's an illusion. Instead, Plato, and so why did Plato say this, right? Why was Plato saying that the sensory world, the tangible world, the empirical world, the objective world, why did he think that it was flawed? Well, he thought it was flawed because, for one, it's temporal. And so these material objects or entities, as the tangents of time will show, everything decays, everything disappears, everything falters, everything is flawed, right? However, when I have a form, an idea in my mind, that idea is flawless, permanent, eternal, right? Universal. So Plato conceived that the truth, even of an entity, he would say, look, I'm able to recognize what a table is. I'm able to recognize what a chair is. I'm able to recognize a television. Why am I able to recognize these things? I'm able to recognize these things because already innately within me, I have these forms. So I recognize a table, right? I know what a table is, and nobody really tells me what a table is because, from birth, I already had that form of the table in my mind. And, someone simply had to refresh my memory so that I can recall the nominalization of that entity or a being or someone or something, right? So I'm able to recognize a table because I have the form in my mind that gives me the essence of what a table is. So I recognize it. I'm able to know what a chair is. I'm able to know what a TV is. I'm able to know what a tree is. How do I know these things? Because I have the essence, that spiritual, mind-based orientation within my mind. So that those mental forms provide for me the truth of reality. So this is Plato's grounding on truthfulness. Right? Now, Aristotle, he didn't disagree with Plato in the importance of reason, but whereas Plato was grounding the nucleus of the truth of reality, for him that nucleus was based on the forms. For Aristotle, that nucleus was based on the material. It was the tangible, the objective, the physical, the sensory that provided the raw data for reality, right? It was the material that allowed him to conceive of particular forms. It's the material that gave an essence to forms. Okay. So, unlike new criticism, structuralism actually begins with the ideals of the French. And I'll point out a couple of notable names. It's the literary critic Roland Barthes, the psychologist Jacques Lacan, and the anthropologist Levi Strauss. Now, like Aristotle, uh, these three gentlemen pointed out how uh, the material provided a sense of understanding for semiotics, provided a sense of understanding for psychoanalysis. The material provided a sense for anthropological discovery, right? Um, so it's these French, right, that gave a sense of an application of structuralism to the world. Now, um, again, thinking back to Aristotle, it's that material reality. Without it, it's going to be very difficult to understand the structure that underlies reality. Right? It's not an individual's or an entity's experience or observations of something. It's the actual material that's grounding the truth of something. Okay. So these structuralists, they apply what's known as an approach that's known as uh, uh, scientific objectivity. And why are they doing this? Well, they're doing this in the sense that, if you think like what Aristotle's saying, you know, Aristotle says, look, we're not going to begin with a conception of something. So if you think about politics, whenever one deals with the political, one's dealing with issues of civic duty or issues of ethical rights and wrongs. Well, all those things they're placing an agent at the center, and that's not the case with structuralism. Structuralism begins not with the agent, right? Not with some psychological attribute, nothing like that. It begins with the material, right? Um, and it should be noted, maybe there's a little bit of irony here in the political sense that this scientific objective approach, um, well, it kind of counters, the this this notion of the political commitment of a political commitment. After all, it's politics that censored science, the arts, inquiry, or discovery. We think back to, um, if we think back to Socrates. Socrates, the great inquirer who asked a lot of questions. Um, it was this so-called Athenian democracy that executed him, right? If you think about the Holocaust or states with um, dictatorships, any types of poetry or art that incited a type of counter or revolutionary ideal. Well, those works were burned, right? Um, those works were censored, right? Banned. Okay. But if you take a scientific objective approach to things, right? Well, we're no longer, we're not dancing with this um, subjective nature of ethical decision making, right, or political decision making, or civic decision making. Right? Okay. Also at the heart of structuralism, structuralism is ultimately, I'm going to start to clarify the issue a little bit. I know it's a little hazy, but um, at the heart of structuralism, what differentiates it from new criticism is this idea of the sign. Now, the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, um, like the structuralists, right? He too set out to apply an objective system for studying the principles of language. So here we are, we're going to study language, but we're going to do so objectively, right? Scientifically, if you will. So, how did he do this? How did de Saussure go about studying the principles of language? Well, he did it by distinguishing um, individual uses of language. So it begins with two terms, parole and lang. So parole is this idea of speech, right? The sentences we write, the sentences we speak, right? Or the phrases, right? And then there's lang. There's the sets of rules that govern English or any language. So I can't just go out into the world and invent a language, right? I can't just randomly invent this, you know, unique sounding language, right? Um, it won't align itself with society, right? With conventions, the conventions of society. Why not? Well, because society has already deemed particular rules and conventions the right way to speak, right? So I'm not necessarily going to observe these series of paroles, right? Because you know, let's say I'm in a room and everybody's speaking a different language, 10 different people and everybody's speaking a different language. Well, this diversity of languages, um, how do I situate them in this? Is it possible to have this universal set of rules that allows me to comprehend these different speech interactions? Okay. So keep this in mind, right? This distinguishing between the application of it, right? The speech, whether it's writing or expressing oneself, and it's the rules governing English or any language that set the sphere. Okay. So if one is a structuralist critic of literature, then one is going to study shared systems of meaning, right? So again, I'm in that room. There's different languages. What are those systems of meaning that can be shared, right? Regardless of the language, across how can in literature, what are those systems of meanings that can be shared? Such as genres or myths, and regardless of a country or state, continent, right? All right. So I'm hoping this is making a little bit more sense. Let's keep looking at this further. So sure, he says something really interesting, right, and logical. He says, look, in language, anytime you have language, you've got these two variables. You've got the variables of a signifier and that which the signifier signifies. So you have the signifier and the signified. Okay. So whatever the word is, and whatever the word is said to signify, that association between the word, the signifier, and the signified is arbitrary. It's generally random, right? And why is it random? Well, let's, think of a horse. So, observe a horse there. So, obviously, we know the form of the horse, right? We know the signified, right, uh, uh, symbol of a horse. But what about the signifiers? Well, look at the differences. Look at the differences of look at the different signifiers, right? Horse in Spanish, caballo, French, le cheval, in Chinese, right? Well, I'm not sure how even to say that one, right? But you've got this diversity of signifiers, and this diversity of signifiers, they so even each one of these signifiers is like a, if you think about the way we express them. So somebody in English is going to say horse. Somebody in Spanish is going to say caballo. Somebody in French is going to say cheval, right? Somebody in Chinese is going to express themselves differently as well, right? So we're not going to worry about the parole, because the parole doesn't allow for a sense of a shared meaning, so to speak. So we might have these different parole conventions, right? These different parole applications. But irregardless of that, there is a shared variable. I mean, I don't think it doesn't matter where you're from. Everyone's going to understand the form or the symbol of a horse, right? So this is you see the structuralist aspect, right? How do we study language in a sense that allows us to identify shared meanings despite the arbitrariness of the signifier-signified relation? Okay, so keep this in mind. Keep this in mind as we look at how it applies in literature in a little. So uh, let's observe a little bit. So sometimes um, we can make a meaning of things phonetically, or we can make a meaning of things conceptually. So again, remember, in new criticism, we are defining the meaning within the work itself. So under structuralism, that's partially true, but what structuralism does is that structuralism is now going to observe shared meanings beyond the work. It's going to observe maybe other particular works, right? And the common signification across other particular works. So observe, phonetically, if you think about the words hop, pop, bop. Well, in English, right, if I hear the words hop, pop, and bop, and the description is in line with a dance, well, a hop is a jovial hop. A pop is, pop music, bop is bebop, a type of dance. So is this a sense of a musical interplay? But what if the description is maybe a war scenario? Well, the hop is no longer jovial, right? The pop is now issues of violence. The bop might take on a different meaning altogether, right? Or what about conceptually, the words huge, monstrous, enormous, colossal, gigantic, skyscraper, right? Is this with reference to, oh, I got a big exam coming up? It's a huge, monstrous, enormous event. Or is this in line with, a big monster out in the horizon? Oh, Godzilla's coming, this monstrous, enormous, colossal, skyscraper-like entity, right? How do we understand in language the shared meanings, right? What are the particular linguistic symbols, the linguistic signs which helps us with the interpretation of something? Okay. There's also dualisms, binaries, right? Opposites. So issues of good and evil, dark and bright, patriarchy and matriarchy. So we can understand something by means of these direct opposites, um, because, for example, this idea that arbitrary labels divide what it in fact is continuous. So if I say the word, if I say the word day, you know, how was your day? Well, it could be anywhere from when I wake up, 7 a.m., right, all the way to when I go to sleep. But obviously, that's not day, right? The day is day. The span of a day runs from maybe the dawn, maybe I don't know, 5:30, 6 a.m., 6:30, to roughly, when depends on shift in time zones, right? But maybe by 7 o'clock-ish, it's already dark, right? So um, so in essence, in reality, right? This is why the experience can't give us the meaning, right? In reality, the scope of a day, the defining of the word, understanding of the word day, um, it's not quite it's not quite clearly understood there, right? What about good? Conceptions of good, right? This notion of, this is complicated, right? Because good is the notion of good is something subjective. But if I bring the notion of evil, right? Well, now good is a little bit more tangible, and same thing with dark, same thing with patriarchy, right? Um, if I have a dualism to a particular word, then an understanding of something becomes a little bit more clear. Okay. So again, uh, um, conceptual understanding, a phonetic understanding, a a dualistic understanding, right? They help structurally. They help understand um, the truthfulness of something, at least, or at least the interpretation of something. Okay. So yes, like new criticism, structuralism is observing and understanding of a work in and of itself. However, the difference is, right, that we're now understanding these shared meanings. So we're doing a comparative of mythology, of anthropology, right? Um, New criticism would define the aesthetics of a work within itself. Structuralism is not doing that. Structuralism is now, the aestheticism of a work is now understood by means of the way in which a sign, of a linguistic sign, is understood via this course of shared meanings, so to speak. Okay. So in a little bit, I'll provide an example, and I'll clarify this notion of shared meanings, if you will. So a quick review. So um, structuralism, it's grounded, thinking back again to Aristotle, it's grounded in that which is materialistic. What are the words? What are the phrases? What are the sentences? What are the signs being used in a work? Right? What are the signs being used in a work? Those help determine the understanding of something. They help determine the underlying structure. So, literature, structures are established in line with the relationship between words and phrases, right? How does a sign, how does it craft itself in relation to other words, to other phrases? Right? Again, think of the words hop, bop, and pop. If my surrounding words or phrases are describing a dance, well then okay, there's my understanding of pop. If I'm in a war scenario, then my understanding of pop is going to change, right? You see a little bit of slight deconstruction, right? But we're not worried about deconstruction yet, although a deconstruction is going to be a response to structuralism. But you notice just there, just in that example I just gave, the composition or the meaning of something is not idle, it's not static, it's not like in new criticism, that I'm only understanding the meaning of a word within the work itself. Structuralism takes into account the possible diversity of shared meanings, right? And so transformations, right, and new meanings might certainly surface. So again, structuralism, yes, we do contextualize the arbitrariness of the sign, but it's still doing so within. It's still in a sense creating a type of universality to the scope of which these signs are shared amongst one another, right? It's not infinite, right? There is a totality to it. So what are critiques of this? And again, deconstruction is going to bring a critique of structuralism. One is universality, right? That these meanings are universal. That the meanings are generally fixed. That they're atemporal. In other words, they're not considering the shifts in time and how shifts in time redefine meanings differently. So again, this scientific approach, it excludes kind of a reader response or an agent's explanation of it. You know, your interpretation of something, it's irrelevant. You know, your interpretation of something, your course of giving something meaning, it doesn't matter, right? Again, we're looking to grasp the meaning within the materiality of a work. Okay. Well, let's look at structuralism and practice. So I'm going to observe the work of Emily Dickinson. I'm generally going to focus on one poem due to copyright issues. This is one of the few poems that I could find on the Commons site. But I'll talk about some of the other poems a little bit generally. So let's observe this. So Emily Dickinson, you know, amongst one of the greatest American poetic writers, if not the greatest American poetic writer. And that's saying a lot, right? Because we've got some great poems throughout history. But sort of this first poem of hers. And this poem is called Hope is the Thing with Feathers. So I'll go ahead and read it, and then I'll talk about these terms of synchronic and diachronic. So, hope is the thing with feathers. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. See, so Emily Dickinson has a beautiful rhyming scheme there. So the word synchronic means that we're going to understand the poem in the present moment, right? So almost within itself. So think of new criticism, right? Diachronic is an understanding of the meanings within the poem chronologically, historically. So what other remembrances can we bring about that help us define this notion of the meanings in Emily Dickinson's poem? So let's look at a couple of things, and I'll go through it. So, um, in the general sense, Emily Dickinson is comparing hope to a bird, right? And this is what we call an extended metaphor. It's a conceit, right? It's an extended metaphor because this this metaphor of hope to a bird, it continues from the beginning all the way to the end, right? This notion of a bird begins at the beginning all the way to the end. And so it's this way we call it an extended metaphor, right? So here's an interpretation that I set about to describe, not necessarily, I mean, obviously I'm interpreting it, but I'm interpreting it uh, within the poem itself. I'm applying. So here I'm notice that my interpretation is, I guess you can argue, synchronically within the span of time of the occurrences of the poem in this present moment, right? So let's go over it again, and then we'll talk. We'll almost go like a line per line analysis. So applying kind of like a new critical approach, right? So hope is the thing with feathers, right? So we have the use of a metaphor, right? There's a description here of hope as a thing with feathers that perches in the soul. So we've got the use of diction, right? In the sense that, for one, purchase, the word purchase, kind of a verb, right? Well, what kind of thing with feathers purchase, right? Kind of thing with feathers grasp something. And so you can see how the use of the metaphor feathers and the use of the diction word purchase, uh, we can logically conclude that it's a bird, right? Now, the next word, soul, next keyword, diction, soul, we've got another use of a metaphor in that this bird is not just any ordinary bird, right? Because here's a bird that is able to grasp or situate itself within the soul. So one can, again, by means of the language of the poem, come to conclude that something spiritually is occurring. Right. The next line, and never stops at all. I'm sorry, and sings the tune without the words. Right. Again, here's the word sings, diction, reaffirming the thing as being a bird. We hear the melodic sounds of birds at times. And never stops at all is kind of like a thematic notion that, this idea of hope doesn't stop, right? Much like the beautiful singing of a bird. And sweetest in the gale is heard, right? So a bit of a diction and irony in that hope is that uh, um, um, this notion of hope is sweet. Why is it sweet? Because it comes, a gale is like a storm, right? A harsh storm, so to speak. And so hope comes, and if it's coming amidst this gale, well, gosh, that's sweet, right? Because we're not just drenching ourselves in this difficult time. And so sore must be the storm. So the word sore is also kind of like an affirming, reaffirming that it's something unpleasant, right? That it's a difficult situation that's occurring that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. So we have a metaphor, an irony, in that you've got this little bird here, abash the little bird. Um, in that um, so 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 hope, obviously this notion of hope as the little bird, it's not as imposing as the storm, right? The storm is by physical measure grander than hope. Yet ironically, this not as this concept, it's not as imposing as the storm. It's still more effective, right? Because it keeps so many warm. Right? So despite the calamity of the storm, this little bird is able to keep people, hope. It's able to keep so many people warm, right? I've heard it in the chillest land. Now, something really interesting here. Uh, I've heard it, a little clause there. I've heard it. It point of view personalizes the previous general account of the poem. So up to this point, it's been generally general, but when we get to the last stanza, I've heard it in the chillest land. You notice that there's a Dickinson is personalizing, and it may not necessarily be her, right? But there's a speaker here now, right? So it's now a little bit more personal. And again, it's not necessarily personal in Emily Dickinson's sense, but perhaps personal in the um, generalization of a speaker and the way he's dealing with how hope is helping him situate, or her situate, a dealing with a storm, right? And on the strangest sea, right? So um, um, so we've got the words. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, right? It it's a metaphor and it's diction, right? So chillest and strangest, so they situate a pair of contexts that are implying a series of discomforting settings, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. Right? So here's the word it, right? That I think I skipped a line there. Yet never in extremity. The word extremity diction, it's a reaffirming the difficulties in which hope is acknowledged, right? Hope is acknowledged in those difficult moments, right? We don't generally, I mean, we might, but we don't generally conceive of hope in situations that are not necessarily trying. It asked a crumb of me. So there, you see the personification, right? Hope is an it, right? It asked, or rather the clause, it asked, right? A crumb of me. So it's not asking. So it's perceived as something with a sense of agency, right? As a living entity, right? A crumb of me is right use of a metaphor that it's not asking for anything from a speaker, so to speak. And so this in a sense provides an analysis, right? Provides kind of like a synchronic new criticism type of analysis in which my interpretation of the poem is grasped within the poem itself. So thematically, I'm noting that hope, like the sweet melodies and beauteous presence of a bird, provides warmth, ease, and comfort without asking anything in return. So there it is. There's an analysis. It's a somewhat of a new critical analysis. Now, let's think about the structural understanding of the poem. So I could have easily applied a new criticism critique of this, but our goal is to understand this structurally. So how is it that the sign of hope is generally shared, right? So we can look at it now diachronically, right? Chronologically. So historically, if we go all the way back to Greek times, classical times, and we think about the mythological entity of Aphrodite, which is synchronous with Venus, she always had this um, kind of wearing of a slight crown with a figure of a dove, right? And of course, we know Aphrodite as goddess of love, right? So the dove here is understood as an entity of love. So there's one understanding of a bird, dove, and how about the Epic of Gilgamesh? A story very similar to Noah's Ark, in which um, they set, they're like on this ark-like entity, and they let loose a dove to see if water has receded. Well, what about the parallel story to that, right? The parallel story of Noah's Ark, in which they set the dove out to see if the water has receded, and it comes back to the ark. In both those entities, right, in Epic of Gilgamesh and Noah's Ark, it's setting it out there. You can see the symbolism of hope, if you will, right? And what about even more evidence? A symbolic of the dove is a symbol of the baptism of Jesus, right? And of Jesus, of course, is if there's ever been a sign of hope, well, there you go. You get the utmost representative of all of Christianity, right? So considering hope is a thing with feathers, right? Emily Dickinson's poem. What bird could she possibly be paralleling with hope? And so, what if I'm a reader and I'm thinking of that symbol, that shared symbol of hope, could it be indeed this dove, so to speak, right? So you see how the structuralist approach works, right? So I went from a new critical approach, and now I'm applying the structuralist approach, right? Okay. So if we've observed the other poems, right, which I'm not demonstrating here for copyright issues, but her poem of "I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died," uh, the fly, is a symbol, could be conceived of as a symbol for, evil, right? A lot of people, they say the fly is a symbol of Lucifer himself, and so when we're thinking of when one dies, in the harsh words of Emily Dickinson, is one going to the promised land? Well, if we've got this fly buzzing there, uh-oh, maybe not, right? Maybe not. And you see the symbolic nature of their time. So this poem doesn't necessarily have the clarification of the contextualization of what this fly, so to speak, but um, if um, if you conceive of it structurally, we can by sign orientations we can conclude that the fly represents a sense of doubtfulness, of skepticism, and maybe even evil, so to speak. What about because I could not stop for death? He kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. It's the first stanza of her beautiful poem. Well, a lot of people fear death, but death is also symbolically, right, uh, um, diachronically understood as you know, the path towards immortality, right? You've ever heard, depending on your faith or maybe cultural belief, but quite often it's not uncommon to hear of death as a walking of the bridge towards immortality, right? So you see how you have these dualisms, right? Or a type of metonymy. We're replacing something for something else. And so here's this is the way structuralism has worked, right? How are these meanings surfacing, so to speak? What about this other poem, right? To all the truth but tell it slant. And in that poem, there's a mention of lightning and how if you tell the truth straightforward to a child, um, it's going to shock them, right? So maybe not so good. So the truth, ever hear like a white lie? Is there nothing wrong with a white lie because it eases the pain, right? Well, here in this case, truth is a parallel to lightning, right? It can be shocking, severe if not handled carefully, right? All right. Well, I hope this helps you. Structuralism is not the easiest thing to understand, but it nevertheless I hopefully gave you some understanding of it, and I hope I differentiated it from your understanding of new criticism, right? So again, new criticism, the understanding of it is within the work itself, and structuralism, it's not idle in that sense. It's dynamic, right? It flows in accordance with shared meanings across different canons or cultures or countries or what have you. So I hope this helps you, and I hope you were enriched by understanding of structuralism. And thank you.